Sherlock Holmes and the Whisper in the Sewing Room. Chapter 1. The Whisper That Should Not Have Been Heard. It is often the case, in my recollection of our most baffling adventures, that a trivial occurrence, the creak of a stair, a misplaced glove, a casual remark uttered in passing, serves as the hinge upon which an entire case turns. Such was the nature of the mystery that began, most curiously, not with blood or violence, but with the soft rustle of muslin and a whisper overheard behind a bolted door. The morning had dawned foggy and grey, casting a mournful haze over Baker Street. I had only just returned from a medical consultation in Paddington and was nursing a tepid cup of tea by the hearth when Holmes, who had remained uncharacteristically idle for the past 3 days, stirred from the window where he had been lounging. "My dear Watson," he said, without turning, "do you recall Lady Margaret Ainsworth?" I glanced up. The name is familiar. Was she not the widow of Colonel Ainsworth, who fell in Afghanistan? Holmes nodded, his keen grey eyes narrowing slightly. Precisely. A respectable family, old Berkshire gentry, with their ancestral seat at Thornbury Hall. A woman of icy reserve and sharp tongue, if my memory serves. She paid me a brief visit 2 years ago regarding a suspected theft of heirloom pearls, though the matter turned out to be a petty domestic squabble. "And now?" I asked. "She has written requesting an urgent appointment." Holmes tapped a folded letter on the sill. "Her phrasing is curious. Listen to this. Mr. Holmes, I do not ask you to believe in ghosts. But I do ask that you investigate one. A whisper was heard last night in a room that has been locked for over 30 years. No one was inside." I leaned forward. "A ghost?" "A whisper," Holmes corrected, "and in the sewing room no less. That is the detail which intrigued me. Why not the cellar, or the West Tower, or some draughty corridor favoured by the authors of penny dreadfuls? A sewing room is far too practical a location for the supernatural." I smiled at the characteristic dryness of his tone. "And what do you propose?" Holmes rose, brushing a bit of ash from his dressing gown. "That we oblige Lady Ainsworth. The 10:45 from Paddington should place us at Thornbury Hall before luncheon." By noon, we had exchanged the foul air of the city for the mist-laced hedgerows of Berkshire. A waiting carriage conveyed us through gates wrought with iron roses and up a gravelled drive flanked by towering yews. Thornbury Hall stood sombre and straight-backed, its stone facade blotched with age and ivy. There was something almost funereal about its symmetry, as though its very architecture disapproved of sentiment. Lady Ainsworth greeted us in the drawing-room, a tall, gaunt woman with hair pulled so tightly back it seemed to stretch the corners of her mouth downward. She offered no handshake, merely a curt nod. "I thank you for coming," she said. "You may laugh, Mr. Holmes. Others have." Holmes inclined his head. "I never laugh at mystery, Lady Ainsworth, only at absurdity." She led us briskly through the hall's hushed corridors. Dust lay thick in the air, and the hush of the house seemed almost deliberate, as if it, too, were holding its breath. At last, she stopped before a heavy oak door with an iron latch. A small sign above it read, "Sewing Room, Unused." "It has remained locked since 1894, she said. "Why?" Holmes asked. "My sister Agnes died in this room. The old woman hesitated. "Took her own life here. We found her at the foot of the sewing table, a silk ribbon still clenched in her hand." "I see," Holmes murmured. "And last night?" "At precisely 10 minutes past 11, Lady Ainsworth said, my maid, Edith, was passing this corridor on her way to fetch linen from the next room. She stopped because she heard a voice, a whisper. She swears it said a single word. Forgive. She dropped the candlestick and fled. Holmes stepped forward, inspecting the door without touching it. Has anyone entered since? No one. I still have the only key. She produced it from a chain at her waist. And the windows? Boarded from the outside. They've never been unsealed. Holmes turned to me with that familiar gleam in his eye. Watson, I believe this is one of those rare cases where superstition may serve as a cloak for far more earthly mischief. We stepped inside together. The air was dry, untouched by time, heavy with the scent of faded lavender and disuse. The room itself was modest. An embroidery stand, shelves of fabric, a cracked porcelain basin, and a pale blue chair by the shuttered window. But it was the sewing table that caught Holmes's attention. The chair beside it was ever so slightly askew. Watson, he said softly, note the fine dust on the floor. Undisturbed except for a faint impression where that chair was shifted. He knelt beside it and ran a gloved finger along the leg. And yet, he whispered, someone sat here last night. The wind outside howled then, as if punctuating the moment. I felt for the first time in many months the familiar chill of anticipation that only a truly baffling case could inspire. Holmes straightened and said calmly, "This is no haunting." Someone wanted that whisper to be heard. The question is, why? And thus began one of the strangest investigations I ever had the privilege of witnessing. Chapter 2. The Maid and the Word. She heard. It was not until we had retired to the morning room, a chamber more warmly lit and less stifled than the rest of Thornbury Hall, that Holmes requested to speak with the maid, Edith. Lady Ainsworth summoned her without protest, though with a tightening of the lips that hinted at disapproval. Within moments, a slender young woman with downcast eyes and a nervous energy stepped into the room. Her hands were clasped tightly before her, and she gave the distinct impression of someone who had not slept well. "You needn't be frightened," Holmes said in his most unthreatening tone. "We are simply hoping to clarify the details of what you experienced last night. Please, take your time." Edith gave a small curtsy, then perched on the edge of an armchair. Her eyes flicked to Lady Ainsworth, who stood by the window like a guardian portrait. Holmes noted the glance and gently interjected. "Lady Ainsworth has given me leave to speak freely with you, and nothing you say will bring you trouble. We are only concerned with the truth." At that, the maid exhaled and nodded. "It was just after 11, sir. I'd been sent to fetch clean linens from the cupboard near the north end of the corridor. I had my candle with me. There's no lamp that far down. As I walked past the sewing room, I heard it. The whisper," Holmes said softly. Edith's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "Yes, sir. It was like someone was right behind the door, only—" I knew the room was locked. It was a woman's voice, low but clear. It said, "Forgive." Just that. Nothing else. Not a breath afterward. "You are certain it came from within the room?" "I swear it, sir. I nearly dropped the candlestick. I turned and ran." "Did you smell anything strange?" Holmes asked. "Smoke, perfume, oil?" "No, sir." "And was there any breeze, draught, or creaking underfoot?" "None that I recall, sir." Holmes tapped his fingers together. "Did you return to the corridor afterward?" Edith flushed slightly. "No, sir. I asked cook to fetch the linens instead. I wouldn't go near that door again." Holmes glanced toward Lady Ainsworth. "Has the maid ever shown signs of hysteria before?" "She is prone to sentiment," the older woman replied crisply, as most girls her age are. "Thank you, Edith," Holmes said, standing. "You've been very helpful." As the girl left, Watson leaned in. "Do you believe her?" "I believe she heard something," Holmes replied. "The question is not whether she is truthful, but whether her senses were deceived." He turned to Lady Ainsworth. "Might we examine the house's plans? I should like to know precisely what lies around and above the sewing room." "You suspect a trick?" she asked. "I suspect," Holmes replied, "that no ghost speaks without an audience." We were soon seated in the library, where Lady Ainsworth produced an aging parchment of Thornbury Hall's floor plan. Holmes spread it across a writing desk, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The sewing room sits at the far end of the second floor," he murmured, tracing his finger, "adjacent to a linen closet and above the disused conservatory. But more interesting is this." He pointed to a thin, near-forgotten gap in the drawing, a narrow shaft running vertically through the wall beside the sewing room. "An old servant's dumbwaiter?" Watson asked. "Possibly," Holmes said, "or a flue. Either would suffice to carry sound." Watson leaned in. "Then someone could have whispered from below?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Precisely. And the acoustics of these old houses, especially with stone and sealed doors, can deceive even a rational mind. I shall need to see that space before nightfall." Lady Ainsworth gave a reluctant nod. "You have leave to explore, but I beg you not to unsettle the household with wild speculation." Holmes inclined his head graciously. "You may rest assured I shall only unsettle those who deserve it." As we made our way down a narrow servant's stair toward the rear of the house, I could not help but feel a sense of anticipation. Holmes had caught the scent, and when that happened, even the dust in the rafters seemed to stir in expectation. The conservatory, once grand, was now a gloom of broken glass and dry soil. Vines clung stubbornly to its iron skeleton, and the air smelled of damp wood and old pollen. At the far end, beneath where the sewing room would be, Holmes found what he was looking for. A closed grate, partially hidden behind stacked gardening pots. He knelt and examined it by the light of a lantern. "See here, Watson," he said, pointing. "An old shaft, once used to vent heat from the conservatory to the upper rooms, long disused but quite capable of conducting sound." He stood and brushed off his knees. "Someone stood here last night. Someone who knew the maid's habits and the timing of her nightly errand." "To what end?" I asked. "That," Holmes said with a gleam in his eye, "is the very question we shall answer." As we turned to leave the dim chamber, a sudden noise echoed through the conservatory, a soft scrape of movement above. Holmes froze. We both looked up toward the ceiling beams and cracked glass. Nothing moved, but the sound had been real. Holmes smiled faintly. "We are not alone in our curiosity." The mystery deepened with each step, and though no blood had been spilled, the case had taken on a sharpness I had not felt in months. A whisper in a sealed room was no ordinary matter, and if Holmes was right, then someone at Thornbury Hall, perhaps someone with a long memory, was stirring ghosts for reasons far from supernatural. Chapter 3. The Locked Door and the Portrait Without Eyes. The following morning dawned pale and windless, a veil of overcast light draping Thornbury Hall in a hushed, spectral calm. Holmes rose early, and after a brisk breakfast taken with an absent mind, requested that we accompany Lady Ainsworth to the sewing room itself. Though she agreed, she did so with what I can only describe as ritualized reluctance, as though partaking in a rite she neither approved of nor believed in. The corridor leading to the sewing room was quiet as a tomb. The red carpet was slightly faded from age, and the walls bore a tapestry of family portraits that seemed to peer down on us with unspoken suspicion. Holmes moved with deliberate steps, pausing now and then to examine the floorboards or trace a faint mark along the skirting. At the end of the corridor stood the infamous door. It was a tall walnut panel with a wrought iron handle and a peculiar keyhole shaped not in the usual oval, but more like a teardrop. Lady Ainsworth produced the key and turned it with a faint creak. "No one has entered since the whisper was heard," she remarked, holding the door open. Holmes nodded, then stepped inside. The room was small, with a low, arched ceiling and faded floral wallpaper. A dust sheet lay across a loom near the fireplace, and the scent of camphor lingered in the air, sharp, medicinal, and oddly out of place. 2 windows looked down upon the eastern gardens, their curtains drawn but not latched. A rosewood cabinet stood in one corner, its glass cracked, the contents inside undisturbed, reels of thread, needles, scraps of fine lace. "It has not been used in years," Lady Ainsworth said, folding her arms tightly. "It was my mother's room once. She embroidered well into her old age." Holmes crossed the room in silence, running his gloved fingers along the table, then stopping at a framed portrait mounted above the hearth. It depicted a woman in late middle age, dressed in a high-collared black gown, her face severe but not unkind. Curiously, the eyes of the painting had faded to near invisibility. Holmes stepped closer. "This portrait," he said almost to himself, "has been tampered with." Lady Ainsworth's head turned sharply. "Tampered?" He pointed. "The paint around the eyes has been scraped or worn away, intentionally, I'd wager. Yet the rest of the work is well preserved." Miss Edith said the voice she heard came from this room. And what better stage for a haunting than a portrait that appears to watch but no longer sees? Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes knelt suddenly beside the hearth and removed a small tool from his pocket. With meticulous care, he began to examine the gaps between the stonework. After a moment, he tapped gently on a particular brick. A hollow sound echoed back. Holmes looked up, eyes gleaming. A false panel. He reached into the satchel he always carried on such investigations and produced a small blade. With deft precision, he loosened the edges of the mortar, and after a minute's work, slid the thin panel free. Inside was a narrow cavity barely wide enough to fit a hand, and nestled within was a folded paper, browned at the edges. Holmes retrieved it, unfolded it, and scanned the words in silence. Watson and I leaned closer, but the detective tucked it away into his coat before we could read. A line. "I shall return to this," he said. Lady Ainsworth's face had gone a shade paler. "You believe someone placed that message there recently?" "I believe someone intended it to be found eventually. By the right person," Holmes replied. He paced to the window, opened it, and peered downward. "There's a slight overhang from the eaves. If someone had climbed along it, say, from the turret stair, it would be quite possible to reach this window from the outside and speak through it. But the maid said the voice came from inside," I noted. Holmes turned. "Indeed. And our Edith is a reliable witness, which is why this was no ordinary deception. Someone wanted the voice to seem supernatural, to unsettle, to be remembered." "Who would do such a thing?" Lady Ainsworth asked, voice tight. Holmes did not answer directly. Instead he said, "Tell me, madam, did your mother die peacefully?" She drew herself up. "She passed in this house. Beyond that, I will not indulge gossip." Holmes gave a slight bow. "I ask only because grief often leaves echoes, and some, it seems, have chosen to amplify them." He moved to the door. "One last question, if I may. Has anything been removed from this room recently? Furniture? A rug? A chest? Lady Ainsworth's brow furrowed. Only a writing desk. It was taken to the attic several weeks ago, too cumbersome to remain. But what of it? Holmes's eyes narrowed. I should very much like to see that desk. With that, we made our way once more through the halls of Thornbury, each room seeming more cryptic than the last. The attic was accessed by a narrow stair behind the servants' wing, steep, splintered and choked with dust. At the top, amid forgotten trunks and furniture draped in linen, Holmes found the desk. A large mahogany piece, its surface scratched by years of use. He pulled open the drawers with great care, then stopped. Watson, look here. Inside the bottom drawer, nearly hidden behind a false panel, was a small compartment lined in velvet, empty save for a faint outline in the dust where something rectangular had once rested. A box, Holmes said softly, perhaps a jewellery case, recently removed. He turned to me, face shadowed with thought. There is more at play here than whispered words. There is theft, and there is memory. As we descended from the attic, the house creaked around us, but whether it was the groan of old timber or something else altogether, I could not be sure. Chapter 4. The Curious Case of Mr. Julius Adwell. That afternoon brought with it an unwelcome dampness, as if the air itself had been stained by the lingering dread of the morning's discoveries. Holmes, however, was revitalized by the very sense of gloom. A house such as Thornbury, he remarked as we descended the main staircase, holds its secrets as a well-bred family holds its scandals, not in denial, but in silence. Lady Ainsworth had excused herself to attend to some correspondence, and Edith had retired to the conservatory. Holmes requested the company of the household's butler, a sinewy, hawk-nosed man by the name of Clegg, who appeared with the stiff carriage of a man trained not only in discretion, but in selective memory. Holmes greeted him courteously. Mr. Clegg, I understand you've been in service to this household for over 3 decades. Yes, sir, since the late Master Ainsworth's youth. And Lady Ainsworth's mother, did she reside here until her death? Clegg gave a slight nod. Madam Cecilia Ainsworth passed 5 winters ago. Her health had been in decline for some time. Lady Ainsworth had the room sealed after that. Holmes studied the butler's face with casual intensity. And there was a desk in that sewing room, mahogany broad with brass inlay, moved recently? Yes, sir. At her ladyship's direction. I had the footman remove it to the attic. It hadn't been used since Madam Cecilia's time. Would anyone else have had access to it in the weeks before it was moved? Unlikely, sir. That room was kept locked. Holmes gave a slow nod. And the other residents of the house, Mr. Clegg? Are there any guests staying beyond the family? Only Mr. Julius Adwell, sir. A cousin on the late master's side. He's taken the blue room on the west wing for a fortnight. At that, Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. Would you be so good as to fetch Mr. Adwell? I should like a word. Clegg bowed and departed without further word. Holmes turned to me. Do you recall the name? I frowned. Julius Adwell. It does strike a chord. Wasn't there a mention in the scandal sheets a year ago? A solicitor, I believe, embroiled in some matter of inheritance fraud. Quite so, Holmes replied. He was never formally charged, but his name fell into disrepute after a certain Lady Fenwick claimed that. Forged documents had mysteriously appeared in her father's will. Documents Adwell had allegedly overseen. Moments later, Mr. Julius Adwell entered the drawing room with the ease of a man confident in the power of charm. He was in his mid-40s, with an immaculately groomed moustache and a cravat tied with theatrical precision. His eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of uncertainty upon seeing Holmes. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," he said, with a smile more polished than sincere. "Clegg said you wished to speak with me. I can only imagine the reason. This curious business about whispers and locked rooms, is it?" Holmes gestured toward a chair. "Indeed, Mr. Adwell. You've been at Thornbury for some days, I understand. A peaceful visit, I trust?" "Perfectly," Adwell replied, seating himself. "Lady Ainsworth is a generous host, though I admit the household has grown rather tense of late." Holmes folded his hands. "Tense, yes. A whisper in a sealed room, a faded portrait, and now, if I may be frank, a missing object of considerable interest." Adwell's brow lifted, though his smile did not fade. "Oh?" "A small jewellery case," Holmes said. "It was once hidden in a drawer of the desk from the sewing room. You would not happen to know where it has gone?" Adwell let out a soft chuckle. "My dear sir, you ask the question as though I might be implicated." Holmes did not blink. "Should I?" There was a moment of silence then, during which the clock on the mantel ticked with intrusive clarity. Adwell rose. "I fear I can be of no assistance. I do not know of any jewellery box, nor have I entered that room." Watson, who had been silent until now, asked gently, "You've had no interest in the house's history, or its former residents?" "I'm a guest," Adwell replied curtly, "not a historian." "Of course," Holmes murmured. "Do forgive the intrusion. Thank you, Mr. Adwell. That will be all, for now." After he departed, Holmes remained silent for a full minute, his gaze fixed on a patch of sunlight warming the floor. "He's lying," he said at last. I sat forward. "You're certain?" "His interest in the house's history is greater than he lets on. You recall the dust imprint in the desk's false drawer. No ordinary guest would have stumbled upon it, nor would they have reason to examine it unless they were looking for something. What could have been in the box? That," Holmes said, rising to his feet, "is what we must determine. But first I should like to speak with Miss Edith again. Alone." I blinked. "You suspect her of something?" Holmes shook his head. "Not at all. But I suspect that she knows more than she realizes, and it is often the innocent who observe the most." Outside, the sky had darkened further, and a light rain now spattered the high windows with a steady rhythm. The house, once merely sombre, now felt like it was holding its breath. As we walked back toward the conservatory, Holmes paused by a small wooden table in the corridor. "Watson," he said, nodding toward it, "do you notice anything peculiar?" I examined it. At first glance it seemed unremarkable, but then I saw it. Beneath the table, faint but unmistakable, were scuff marks on the floorboards. "Something heavy was moved," I said. Holmes nodded. "And recently." He stared down the hallway toward the portrait gallery. "I believe, my dear Watson," he said quietly, "that someone has rearranged more than just the furniture at Thornbury." Chapter 5. The Portrait in the Corridor. The scuff marks Holmes had noticed beneath the side table were no mere triviality. To Holmes, they were as loud as a cry for help, a quiet disruption in an otherwise disciplined order. As we stood in the corridor outside the conservatory, he stooped and ran his fingers lightly over the scratched floorboards, frowning with mild satisfaction. "A heavy frame," he murmured, "lifted recently, likely by someone unpracticed in the art. Note the dragging at the corner. There's hesitation in the movement, uncertain hands." "You believe it was a painting?" I asked. "Or a mirror, perhaps," Holmes replied. "Though in a house like this, a mirror is rarely hidden unless it reveals more than one wishes it to." He stood and moved to the opposite wall, where a series of ancestral portraits lined the corridor in a regimented procession, some dull with age, others cleaned and recently revarnished. One, however, had a slight tilt to its frame. Holmes's long fingers reached up, adjusted it, and then paused. Behind the portrait's top right corner was a sliver of pale, newer plaster, distinct from the faded ochre paint that covered the rest of the wall. "Well, well," Holmes whispered, "tampering." He gently removed the portrait of a grim-faced Ainsworth patriarch and propped it against the wall. What emerged was a small recess in the wall, roughly the size of a shoebox, freshly plastered over and sealed. The plaster was uneven, amateurish even. Holmes tapped it gently. "Hollow," he said. Without asking for tools, he reached into his inner coat pocket and produced a thin blade he often carried for delicate tasks. With careful, quiet precision, he began scoring the plaster, working at its corners until the surface cracked and flaked away to reveal a small wooden cavity built into the wall. It was empty. "Recently disturbed," Holmes said, more to himself than to me. "The dust is missing, the edges too clean." I watched in silence as he examined the compartment's interior, then the surrounding wall, and finally the painting he had removed. He inspected its back, running his fingers along the wood. "There are scratch marks on the bottom frame," he murmured. "It was used as leverage, likely to pry something out." "What do you believe was kept there?" I asked. Holmes replaced the portrait, carefully concealing the cavity once more. "Whatever once lay hidden here was removed within the last 3 days, he said. "And I dare say it wasn't done by Lady Ainsworth. This sort of concealment suggests an old family secret, perhaps a letter, a document, something dangerous to the wrong hands." "Adwell?" I guessed. Holmes merely gave a non-committal shrug and turned back toward the conservatory. Miss Edith Ainsworth was seated alone at the end of the room, a book open in her lap, but clearly unread. She looked up as we entered and smiled faintly. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "did you find anything in the sewing room?" "Several things," he replied, "though answers are not yet among them." "May I sit?" She gestured to the chair beside her. Holmes studied her for a moment before speaking. "Miss Ainsworth, I wonder if I might ask something slightly impertinent. When your grandmother died, did she leave behind any personal writings, diaries, letters, unfinished memoirs?" She blinked. "None that I know of. But grandmother was private. Even mother knew little of her past." "Did she have enemies?" "Enemies?" Edith frowned. "Number. At least not that I ever heard of. She seldom left the house in her later years, though—" She paused, her brow furrowing. "There was a man. I remember him visiting years ago, long before grandmother took ill. He frightened me as a child. He had a cane with a silver tip shaped like a serpent. His name escapes me." Holmes leaned forward. "Do you recall how your grandmother reacted to his visit?" "She was angry afterward. I remember voices through the wall, mother and grandmother shouting, something about a promise broken." Holmes absorbed this with interest. "And your cousin, Mr. Adwell, does he know this man?" "I've no idea," she said. "Julius only began visiting after grandmother passed. We hadn't seen him for years before that." Holmes gave her a gentle nod. "Thank you, Miss Ainsworth. You've been most helpful." We took our leave and were silent until we returned to the study. There, Holmes finally spoke. "That serpent-handled cane is no coincidence, Watson. A Mr. Lionel Brockstead, now deceased, was known to carry such an affectation. He was a collector of antiquities and something of a blackmailer. He also once held a partnership with a young solicitor named Julius Adwell." My eyebrows rose. You believe Broxted and Adwell were conspiring. I believe Broxted had access to some damning material about the Ainsworth family. Upon his death, it seems likely that Adwell, perhaps to settle old scores or acquire leverage, retraced Broxted's steps. That hidden recess, a perfect place to store a document one dare not destroy but cannot reveal. And the whispering in the sewing room? Holmes's expression grew grave. That is what troubles me most. If we assume Adwell found something, and I believe he did, he is not the only one who knew where to look, which means there is another player involved, one who knows the house even more intimately. You mean a member of the family? Holmes gave a thin smile. Or someone who once was. He moved to the desk and withdrew his notebook. It is time we brought the rest of this house into the light, Watson, before someone else decides to silence it forever. Chapter 6. The Candle That Would Not Burn. By the time the sun dipped below the mist-strewn moors, casting long amber shafts across the windows of Ainsworth Hall, the house had quieted to a tense hush. The servants moved more cautiously, their footsteps muffled, as though they too felt the shift in the atmosphere. Holmes stood by the window in the study, arms folded behind his back, eyes narrowed to slits as he watched the heavy clouds settle over the estate. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked. The whispering, the sealed recess, Adwell's evasiveness. There are too many directions to look. He turned from the window, face thoughtful. "Just so, Watson, but not all directions are equal. What we need now is not noise, but silence." I knew that look in Holmes's eye, a spark that signaled his mind was chasing something just beyond reach. Without further explanation, he stepped to the corner of the study, where a brass bell pull hung near the shelves. "We require assistance," he said, tugging the cord. A few minutes later, the butler, Hargreaves, entered, composed and silent. "You rang, sir?" "Indeed," Holmes said. "I'd like to examine the guest rooms, particularly the one occupied last by Mr. Adwell. Also, the room that once belonged to Lady Ainsworth." Hargreaves inclined his head. "Very good, Mr. Holmes, if you'll follow me." We ascended the staircase once more, passing the long gallery of painted faces, whose eyes seemed to follow us. The hall above was cooler, the air tinged with lavender and old wood polish. Hargreaves led us first to Lady Ainsworth's chamber. It was a museum of stillness. Pale drapes drawn back revealed an immaculately preserved room, embroidered cushions on the high-backed chair, an untouched porcelain brush set on the vanity, and a single vase of dried roses resting near the hearth. Holmes moved deliberately, his eyes scanning every corner. He stopped at the hearth and knelt, brushing his fingers along the soot. "Recently cleaned," he said. "Only last week, sir," Hargreaves replied. "And was it in use?" "No, sir. The chimney sweep was scheduled regardless, part of the house's routine." Holmes's eyes flicked to the mantel. 3 candlesticks stood there, each with its candle at varying lengths. One, unlike the others, had a wick untouched by flame. "Odd," Holmes muttered. "Who maintains this room now?" "Mrs. Trellis, the housekeeper." "And this candle here, has she ever mentioned why it remains unused?" "Not to my knowledge. I can summon her if you wish." "No," Holmes said quickly. "That won't be necessary. I prefer observations untainted by self-conscious memory." He removed the unburnt candle and held it up to the light, sniffed it briefly, then handed it to me. "Notice anything, Watson?" I examined it. "There's something strange in the wax, embedded, near the base. A wire." Holmes nodded. "A thin sliver of wire. A filament, possibly from a fuse. What better place to conceal a crude ignition mechanism than within a candle no one would think to light?" I stiffened. You think someone meant to start a fire? No, my dear Watson, Holmes said softly. I think someone meant to destroy evidence, but the opportunity never arose. Either they were interrupted, or they feared the consequences would draw attention. He turned abruptly. Now to Adwell's room. We crossed the hall. Hargreaves opened the guest room, revealing a stark contrast to Lady Ainsworth's chamber. The room was tidy, but in a perfunctory way. A valise rested open on the bed, its contents haphazard. 2 changes of linen, a shaving kit, and a slim notebook whose cover bore a faint embossing, W.K.S. and Company. Holmes lifted it and leafed through quickly. No writing, only an index of numbers. He passed it to me. Financials, perhaps? Possibly, I said. Or code? More likely a ledger, masked in banality. Holmes then moved to the writing desk. Its surface was clean, save for an ink blotter and a sheet of paper that bore an indentation. Someone had written upon it, then removed the page. Holmes retrieved a pencil from his pocket, rubbed the side gently across the page, and slowly, a few words emerged. Shall return it, once I have, not before. He tilted his head. Return it. Perhaps the document hidden behind the portrait? If Adwell left this, then he took whatever was there. But what precisely is it? I stepped to the window and looked out. The moonlight had broken through now, casting a spectral gleam over the conservatory's glass dome below. Holmes joined me. Do you hear that? He said suddenly. I listened, heart quickening. There, from below, just faint enough to be imagined, came a sound like a soft click. 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 The sewing room, Holmes said sharply. That rhythmic sound, it's not a whisper. It's mechanical. We rushed down the stairs, Hargreaves hurrying to keep pace. As we neared the West Wing corridor, the clicking stopped. Holmes opened the door to the sewing room. The fireplace lay cold, the machine still, the air oddly heavy. He crossed swiftly to the sewing machine, examined the treadle, then bent and sniffed near the base. Watson, smell this. I did as told. It's faint, but kerosene? Indeed. Holmes straightened. Someone attempted to use the sewing machine as a decoy, a method of noise to misdirect us. But the kerosene, likely from a lantern, suggests they were operating here in secret, possibly reading or searching, using the hum of the machine to mask their presence. But who? Holmes turned toward the door. That, Watson, is what we shall soon uncover. Tonight, the whisper in this room shall be met with silence. And the truth. Chapter 7. A note in lavender ink. The following morning brought no clarity, only a mist that clung to the fields and softened the outlines of Ainsworth Hall into a ghostly sketch. Holmes had spent much of the night pacing the library, muttering fragments of thought, consulting his pocket journal, and drifting in and out of silent concentration. I, for my part, had dozed briefly in an armchair, awakening to find Holmes already fully dressed, gazing out the window toward the east lawn. You will join me for a short walk, Watson, he said without turning. A walk in this fog? Precisely because of the fog. It encourages concealment. But not all concealments succeed. We set out after breakfast, declining Hargreaves's offer of cloaks. The air was cool and damp, and the gravel of the garden paths gave underfoot with a softened crunch. Holmes led us not to the front lawn or conservatory, but around the side, to the neglected west quadrant that bordered the gardener's sheds and compost heaps. A cracked stone bench lay half-buried in ivy, and beside it a heap of wood planks covered by tarpaulin. Notice anything peculiar? Holmes asked, motioning toward the bench. I studied the area. At first glance, It was unremarkable. But then I saw it. A cluster of flattened grass leading up to the tarpaulin. Someone had been here recently, and not idly. A square of wax paper poked out from beneath the planks. Holmes extracted it delicately and held it up. Written in faint lavender ink were 5 words, each carefully scrawled in looping cursive. "You said it was safe." He handed it to me, his face unreadable. Lavender ink, a peculiar choice. In my experience, it often signifies an affectation, preferred by romantics, artists, or those wishing to present gentility. But it's also distinctive, which makes it careless. "You think it was meant to be found?" "Not at all. I believe it was hastily discarded and overlooked." He tapped the paper. "But that phrase, it is not a threat. It is a protest. Directed at Adwell? Perhaps. Or perhaps someone else entirely. Come, let us pay a visit to the conservatory." We cut through the rear garden and entered the glass house. The air inside was thick with the scent of soil and citrus. Orange trees stood in pots by the far wall, and a line of orchids in full bloom hung like suspended stars. Holmes moved among them, gently parting leaves, lifting small pots, tapping the panes. In a far corner, he stopped by a wooden planting table. A book lay there, half covered by a glove. Holmes lifted the glove, smaller than a man's, and revealed a volume of poetry. "Mrs. Eliza Mayhew's, no doubt," Holmes murmured, scanning the spine. "I observed her tendency to drift here in the afternoons." He opened the book, and there, between the pages, was a folded scrap of notepaper. "Meet me by the cypress just before dusk. No one must know." There was no signature, but the script was the same. Lavender ink, the same loops and flourishes. Holmes held it to the light and sniffed. "Jasmine oil," he said. "A perfume trace. Mrs. Mayhew wears it." "You think she was involved romantically with Adwell?" "Possibly. Or she was being manipulated. Either way, she did not write this note to herself." At that moment, the conservatory door creaked open. We turned to see Eliza Mayhew herself entering, carrying a small watering can and dressed in a lavender shawl. Her face, when she saw us, froze momentarily, though she quickly forced a smile. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I didn't expect anyone here this early." "Forgive us, Mrs. Mayhew," Holmes said kindly. "We were admiring the orchids. Your care is evident." She blushed. "It passes the time. This place used to be my mother's favorite spot. She loved peace and symmetry. Much like yourself, I imagine. Tell me, were you in the garden yesterday evening?" She blinked. "No, Why do you ask?" Holmes held up the note. "This was found near the west lawn. I believe you've seen it before." Her composure cracked. I don't know what you mean." "You recognize the handwriting." Her silence answered for her. After a moment she sighed and sank onto the edge of the potting bench. "I didn't mean to lie. I thought it would be harmless. I didn't want to cause trouble." Holmes remained quiet, his expression encouraging but firm. "It was from Mr. Adwell," she admitted. "He asked me to meet him by the cypress tree. He said he needed to show me something, but I was afraid. I didn't go." "What did he wish to show you?" "I don't know. But he kept asking if I trusted him. He said it concerned a letter, something hidden for years, something dangerous if mishandled." Holmes nodded slowly. "Did he mention your mother?" She stiffened. "Once. He said my mother may have kept secrets even from me." "Did she?" Eliza's eyes shimmered. "She was complex. She was loyal to the family, but she had her own sadness. There were whispers, servant talk, that she once destroyed a letter meant for my father years ago. A letter that might have changed everything." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "I believe," Holmes said gently, "that letter has resurfaced, and it may have driven someone in this house to desperation." He bowed. "Thank you, Mrs. Mayhew. You've been most helpful." As we stepped back out into the pale sunlight, Holmes placed the folded note in his coat. "Watson," he said, "there is a cypress tree at the edge of the west lawn. I believe it's time we examined the spot where Eliza never arrived, but someone else very well might have." Chapter 8. Beneath the cypress. The cypress tree stood at the furthest edge of the Ainsworth estate, its gnarled limbs clawing into the fog like an old man's hands. Unlike the manicured paths and rose trellises of the main garden, this section of the grounds was wilder, left to grow as it pleased. Tall grass brushed our knees, and brambles snagged at our trousers. But Holmes walked ahead of me with purpose, weaving through the overgrowth as though following an invisible line drawn in his mind. This meeting place? "Why here?" I asked, ducking beneath a low-hanging bough. "Why not the conservatory again, or even the crypt?" "Because it's private," Holmes replied. "Too far for the household to overhear, too near for suspicion if one feigned a stroll." The ground beneath the tree was damp and uneven, but Holmes paused, scanned the area with narrowed eyes, then suddenly crouched. I moved beside him. "Observe, Watson. 2 sets of footprints, one lighter, likely feminine, and the other broader, with the sole of a man's boot." He pointed to the softer impressions leading in from the north path, and another pair, partially overlaid, leading away toward the south hedge. Someone was here before Eliza, perhaps before she even received the note. Holmes brushed aside a patch of grass and uncovered something metallic half buried in the earth. He withdrew it carefully with a gloved hand. "A button," he murmured. "Black, military style. Old stitching still attached. It matches neither Adwell's evening coat nor Lord Ainsworth's livery." He turned it over. There, barely visible in the grime, was a maker's stamp, G. Perrine and Sons, Edinburgh. "Curious," he said. "A Scottish tailor, known for producing officers' uniforms before the war. But who here would own such a garment?" "Surely not Adwell," I said. "His service was brief, and he left before being formally commissioned." "Precisely. And yet this button was torn recently. The thread is still frayed and curled." Holmes placed the button in a small envelope and slipped it into his coat. He rose and studied the cypress trunk, noting with interest a faint scarring of the bark. "Knives leave wounds on wood," he said, tapping the gash. "Someone carved something here. A message, perhaps. But it was scraped off in haste." I stepped back and surveyed the whole tree. Indeed, the bark looked freshly marred in one spot, as though a small rectangular section had been deliberately removed. Just then, the wind shifted, and with it came a rustling in the hedges behind us. We turned. Emerging from the thicket was Mr. Arthur Hume, Lord Ainsworth's personal secretary. His sleeves were rolled up, and he carried a pair of garden shears. Upon seeing us, he stopped abruptly, his features tightening. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I was tending to the southern hedge. I didn't expect company here." Holmes smiled without warmth. "You seem a man of many talents, Mr. Hume. Secretary, steward, and now gardener." "I do what's necessary," Hume replied stiffly. "Since the master reduced the groundskeeping staff last month, many of us have had to take on extra duties." Holmes tilted his head. "You wouldn't happen to own a greatcoat tailored in Edinburgh, would you?" The question struck like a thrown dagger. For a moment, Hume's lips parted, but no answer came. Then he forced a chuckle. "Edinburgh. Number I've never been." "Of course," Holmes murmured. Forgive my curiosity. Hume shifted uneasily. May I ask what brings you to this corner of the garden? We're retracing the steps of a ghost, Holmes replied cryptically. One who may have whispered truths, others would rather remained buried. With that, he turned and began walking back toward the house. I followed, casting one last glance over my shoulder at Arthur Hume, who now stood alone beneath the cypress, his shears forgotten at his side. Back at the drawing room, Holmes wasted no time. He sent a note by messenger to Scotland Yard, requesting a background file on Arthur Hume and any known military service. Then he returned to the crypt with me in tow. This case, he muttered as we descended, is not merely one of murder. It is one of fear. A long brewing dread that someone took great pains to hide, yet which has begun to seep through the seams of this house. Inside the crypt, he returned to the spot where Adwell's body had been found. He kneeled once more beside the loose stone, removing it and searching deeper into the hollow beneath. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Absence," Holmes replied. "Something was taken. The dust tells the tale. Indeed, there was a square of clean stone surrounded by settled grit, perhaps the size of a folded letter or a small journal. I believe," Holmes said, rising, "that a document was hidden here, one likely known only to the deceased, and perhaps to Mrs. Eliza Mayhew's late mother." "A letter?" I asked. "The one Eliza mentioned?" "I suspect so. And someone found it before Adwell could act." He paced slowly, then stopped. "Tonight," he said, "we shall invite all parties for a small gathering in the parlour. We shall ask questions, drink tea, and speak lightly of ghosts. And then, when the right moment comes, I shall spring the trap." "You know the culprit, then?" I asked. Holmes looked at me, his eyes glinting. "I know the motive. The hand that delivered the final blow remains uncertain, but only for now." Chapter 9. The Parlour of Shadows. That evening, as the clock in the hall struck 7, the inhabitants of Ainsworth Manor assembled in the blue and gold parlour at Holmes's request. Holmes stood by the fireplace with his arms crossed, his gaze drifting not to any single person but to the subtle movements between them, the flutter of a handkerchief, the tap of a shoe against the carpet, the sideways glance not meant to be noticed. Lady Ainsworth arrived last, dressed in a gown of black silk, her fingers encased in delicate gloves despite the warmth of the room. Eliza sat beside her, pale but composed. Arthur Hume stood rigidly in the corner by the window, arms behind his back like a man expecting inspection. Lord Ainsworth had not appeared. Holmes motioned for me to sit beside him, and the room settled into a strained hush. "I am grateful to you all for coming," Holmes began, his tone mild. "In recent days, a dreadful crime has occurred under this roof. A man is dead, Mr. Thomas Adwell. His body, as you know, was found in the family crypt. The circumstances are curious, but not, I believe, without explanation." Lady Ainsworth raised a brow. "Have you discovered who committed this dreadful act?" "In time, Lady Ainsworth. But first, allow me a small indulgence. Mr. Hume, would you be so kind as to tell us where you were on the evening before last between 9 and 11 o'clock? Arthur Hume stiffened. "I was in my room, reading. I retired early." "Alone?" "Yes," Holmes nodded. "And your uniform, do you keep it with you still?" "My uniform? I understand you served briefly in the 4th Regiment of Foot. You left before deployment due to injury, but you were issued formal attire, including a coat, were you not?" Hume hesitated. "Yes, it's packed away. And might I ask if that coat is missing a button?" Silence fell. Hume's jaw tightened. I'm not sure. Holmes turned away, apparently satisfied. Very well. Miss Mayhew, when you received the letter asking you to meet in the crypt, did you recognize the handwriting? Eliza's hands gripped the hem of her dress. No, Mr. Holmes. It was written in block letters. Do you still have it? Number I was frightened. I burned it the following morning. Holmes nodded again, turning to Lady Ainsworth. Forgive my intrusion, but I must ask, did you know of a letter hidden in the crypt by your late sister? Lady Ainsworth blinked. No. My sister kept many secrets in her life, I fear. Holmes paced slowly to the side table, where a silver tea service had been laid out, untouched. He poured himself a cup, added no sugar, and took a long sip before placing it down again. There is a tree in the far garden, he said suddenly, a cypress. Beneath it, someone met another in secret. It is an old place, forgotten by most of the household, but not by everyone. Lady Ainsworth's hand trembled. What are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes? Only this, that Thomas Adwell was not killed over a simple affair or blackmail. He was silenced, not for what he had done, but for what he had discovered. He turned back to Hume. A man who wears a coat missing a Perrin and Sons button, who denied having visited Edinburgh yet served under a regiment based there. A man who, as secretary, had access to every document, every corner of this house. You're accusing me? Hume's voice cracked, sharp. I am suggesting your story has inconsistencies. I did not kill him. No? Holmes walked closer. Then why did you scrape the bark from the tree behind the cypress? Why did you take the letter from the crypt? Hume's face reddened. I don't know what you're talking about. But someone does, Holmes said softly. He turned. Eliza. She looked up. You said your mother warned you of secrets. Did she mention anything about the cypress tree? Eliza swallowed. She told me, once when I was small, that I must never go there. She said the tree listened. The tree listened, Holmes echoed. Indeed. I believe your mother once hid something there, perhaps a copy of a confession or evidence concerning a family matter. Someone else knew and feared its rediscovery. A voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. I believe that's quite enough, Mr. Holmes. Lord Ainsworth stood in the doorway, his face lined, his gaze ice-cold. You are a guest in my house, he said. This line of questioning borders on scandalous. Holmes inclined his head. And yet, my lord, scandal has already arrived. A man is dead, a woman frightened. Lies have grown like ivy on this house. Ainsworth stepped into the room, eyes on his daughter. There are matters of the past, he said, but none that justify this circus. Holmes studied him for a moment. Then, gently, he said, We shall see. He turned back to the group. Tomorrow morning, he said, I shall require everyone's presence in the library. There is one piece left, one small truth. When it emerges, the rest shall fall into place. He bowed faintly. Good evening. With that, he walked past Lord Ainsworth, whose lips pressed into a thin line, and exited the parlour. I followed close behind. In the corridor, I asked, Holmes, do you have it now? The truth? He paused beneath the gaslight, his eyes distant. Not yet, he said. But I know where to look, and I believe the whisper in the sewing room is finally ready to speak. Chapter 10. The Night Behind the Bolted Door. The moon rose over Ainsworth Manor that night with a solemn indifference, its pale light brushing the edges of stone windows and half-drawn curtains. Within the house, silence reigned, a silence unlike that of sleep or peace. But the stillness of breath held too long. I found it difficult to rest, and judging by the soft footsteps and the low creak of boards, I was not alone. Holmes, as ever, remained restless. I discovered him in the lower corridor, pacing, his dressing gown loose, pipe unlit in his hand. He paused only when I drew near. "You believe the killer is among them still?" I asked in a whisper. "I do not believe Watson. I observe," he replied softly, "and observation confirms that truth hangs by a thread, very thin, very taut. All it needs now is one tug." He began pacing again, slower now. "There is a locked room at the end of the east wing. Miss Eliza Mayhew mentioned it once offhandedly when describing her movements that evening. The corridor with the sewing room and the one with the old nursery. I never use that wing," she said. And yet she had no way of knowing the nursery was next to the sewing room unless she had walked there. "Curious," I murmured, "but hardly damning." "Number." But damning lies not in the room itself, but what remains within it. Holmes stopped abruptly and turned to me. "I shall need your assistance, Watson. We must visit the sewing room. Tonight." I blinked. "At this hour?" He gave me a half smile. "Crime does not sleep, my friend, nor must we." With a lantern borrowed from the servants' quarters and our footsteps as quiet as the air itself, we made our way to the east wing. It was a part of the house I had not yet seen, narrower, darker, and less adorned. The portraits were fewer here, and those that remained had been draped with dusty cloths, the air thick with forgotten linen and beeswax. We arrived at the last door on the corridor. Holmes bent to examine the keyhole. "Locked," he murmured, "but not recently. See the dust along the hinge. And this—" He pointed to a faint scrape just below the lock. A key was forced, not elegantly. Holmes reached into his dressing gown and produced a thin sliver of metal. Within moments, he had coaxed the lock open with the silent confidence of long practice. Inside, the room was exactly as one might expect. Bolts of fabric stacked haphazardly on open shelves, an old sewing machine with its treadle frozen in place, and a faint but persistent scent of lavender and starch. Moonlight filtered in through a curtainless window, casting pale patterns across the floor. Holmes did not hesitate. He moved directly to the far wall where a tall cupboard stood. It groaned faintly as he opened it, revealing rows of folded cloth, spools of thread, and behind them, something curious. "A box," Holmes whispered, drawing it out. It was wooden, about the size of a hat box, with a brass latch and no markings. He placed it on the table between us and flipped open the lid. Inside lay letters, dozens of them, bound in ribbons of fading blue and ivory. He lifted one. The handwriting was clear and fine. "Lady Ainsworth's," I noted at once. "These were not intended to be found," Holmes said, leafing through several. "Are they confessions?" I asked, peering over. "Confessions of the heart, perhaps. They are written to her sister. Dates ranging from 1871 to 1877. Here," he stopped. "This one is different." He read aloud. "Dearest Eleanor, the tree you planted still stands, and I have done as you asked. The paper is hidden behind the frame, where the little bird once hung. No one looks there any more. I pray no one ever shall. The truth can only wound." Holmes looked up at me. Behind the frame, a picture perhaps, once hung on the wall by the cypress tree. "And the letter?" I asked. "What truth does it conceal? We must find out, but not now. It is too exposed by daylight." We replaced the box and left the room undisturbed, locking it once more behind us. As we made our way back toward our quarters, Holmes halted again in the main hall. From somewhere above, we heard a soft creak. Floorboards shifting, perhaps. Then the faintest of sounds, the turning of a doorknob, the flutter of a curtain caught in breeze or breath. "Someone else is awake," Holmes said. "Let them be, for now." I frowned. "Do you think they followed us?" "I think they will check the sewing room before dawn," Holmes replied. "And when they find it exactly as they left it, they'll believe their secret remains safe. That, my dear Watson, is how we keep the spider on the web." Chapter 11. The Cypress and the Hidden Paper. The next morning arrived with a brittle clarity, the sky washed in a crisp hue of winter blue, and the lawns outside Ainsworth Manor stiff with frost. Holmes, who had slept perhaps 3 hours at most, was already dressed and seated at the breakfast table when I descended. He offered me no greeting, but pushed aside his untouched eggs, and instead laid before me a folded map, hand-drawn and annotated in his unmistakable script. "We shall walk the grounds after breakfast, Watson," he said. "There is a cypress tree on the northern side, beyond the walled garden. Lady Ainsworth's letter makes clear it bears more than roots." I nodded and poured tea. "What are we looking for precisely?" "The hidden paper mentioned?" "Precisely that. If her words are to be trusted, it has remained undisturbed for decades. But I suspect it is not forgotten. Someone remembered it, enough to murder for it." We finished our breakfast swiftly and made our way across the rear of the house, past the frost-covered greenhouse and through the garden gate, which groaned under the weight of rust and disuse. The northern grounds were quiet and shaded. A line of cypress trees stood like mute sentinels along a narrow gravel path. "There," Holmes pointed, "that one is older. The base is split. See how the trunk widens near the roots?" Something was planted near it. We moved closer. Behind the tree was a low wall, crumbling slightly, the mortar cracked, and above it hung a wooden picture frame, half covered in lichen, nailed directly into the brickwork. "Curious," I murmured. "Why hang a frame in the garden?" Holmes said nothing. He reached behind the frame and produced a brittle envelope, the paper yellowed and flecked with damp. "Still here," he whispered, "as she promised." We returned indoors before opening it, and Holmes insisted we do so in his room, where he could ensure privacy. With gloves, he delicately broke the seal and drew out a single page, its handwriting tight and almost illegible from age. As he read, his brow furrowed deeper and deeper. I watched his face grow taut with focus. When at last he set the page down, he tapped it with a finger. "This," he said, "is the cornerstone of the entire affair. Read it aloud, Watson." I obeyed. "To whomever may find this and doubt my mind, I beg you, know that what I write is true. The child was not hers. Eleanor Ainsworth bore no son. The boy she claimed as hers, Henry, was taken from my arms. My boy, my shame, hidden from the world to preserve her name and reputation. I was never to speak of it, but I could not take it to my grave. Forgive me." There was silence. My mouth had gone dry. "Good heavens," I said at last. "Then Henry Ainsworth is not who he claims to be?" "Indeed," Holmes replied softly. "Lady Eleanor committed a grievous deception. She took her sister's child, possibly with the sister's coerced permission, and raised him as her heir. That secret, once buried in youth, has remained locked in this house like a ghost." I stared at the paper again. But what could this mean for the case? "It means, Watson," Holmes said, "that the motive for murder may lie not in recent conflicts, but in a truth decades old. And more importantly, that someone else already knew this letter existed. Someone who feared it might resurface." I suddenly remembered the locked sewing room. Then the killer's intention was not theft, but concealment. Precisely. They rifled the sewing room, not for valuables, but for proof. They feared this document had already been uncovered. That fear may have led to murder. Holmes stood and paced slowly. There is one figure in this household who would have everything to lose if Henry Ainsworth's legitimacy were challenged, especially if the inheritance of the estate were in question. "Eliza?" I asked, startled. "No," Holmes replied with quiet gravity. "Miss Eliza Mayhew may have her suspicions, but I do not believe her capable of murder. No, I speak of Mr. Gregory Tate, Eleanor Ainsworth's legal advisor and executor of her estate." "But why?" "Because Tate has been managing the Ainsworth finances for over 2 decades. If the heir's claim is void and the estate reverts to its original family line, Tate's control crumbles. And if," Holmes paused, "if it can be proven that he knew this truth and suppressed it, he is liable not just for concealment, but fraud." He turned to me suddenly. "We must confront him, but carefully. Tonight we shall set a bait, a letter, forged in the style of Lady Ainsworth's handwriting, implying that the original confession has been handed to the authorities. I want to see who takes the bait." "You believe he will come for it?" "If he does not, then we must look elsewhere," Holmes said. "But if he does, we may finally catch the whisper that started it all." Chapter 12. The letter in the hearth. The dusk settled over Ainsworth Manor like a deepening spell, shadows stretching long across the parlour as the last embers of daylight flickered in the high windows. Holmes, ever the orchestrator, sat by the writing desk with a single candle burning low, drafting a letter in an imitation of Lady Eleanor's hand, with a precision that would have fooled even the most intimate observer. "There," he murmured, sealing the letter with aged wax taken from Eleanor's own correspondence drawer. "This will serve nicely." He turned to me. "Watson, place this in the grate of the library hearth, just enough to be visible, as though dropped accidentally in the attempt to destroy it." "Will we be watching from within?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Too risky, but I've arranged something better." From beneath his coat he revealed a small brass key. "The dumbwaiter shaft from the scullery leads directly behind the library wall. There is a service alcove for placing food, out of sight, but within earshot." "And you mean to crouch in a dumbwaiter, Holmes?" His lips twitched. "I've endured worse in the name of clarity." Thus, an hour later, with the manor fallen into the hush of after-dinner hours, we took our places. Holmes, folded like a cat into the scullery shaft behind the thin wooden wall of the library, passed me the signal rope. I waited in the darkened stairwell outside the servants' quarters, ready to run should anything go amiss. Time passed slowly. The kind of silence that builds tension, that strains the ears with imagined movement. The wind rattled the ivy on the windows. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked, but the library remained undisturbed. Then, at precisely 10:30, footsteps. Measured, cautious. A pause at the threshold, the faint creak of the library door opening. Holmes would see nothing, but he would hear everything. Later, in whispered recounting, he told me what followed. The steps entered with care. The figure moved across the rug, then a rustle. The sound of someone crouching, fingers brushing paper. A sudden intake of breath. Then, the fire irons scraped. The letter was thrust into the hearth. Holmes heard the paper crackle. Then a voice, low, hissing with urgency. "Foolish woman. Why didn't you burn it?" The voice was unmistakable. Gregory Tate. Holmes remained silent, frozen in place, as Tate knelt by the fireplace, muttering further invectives. When the burning ceased, Holmes waited until the man left before extracting himself from the shaft. He was beside me moments later, covered in soot and spider webs. "He took the bait," he said simply, "which means he knew." "But he destroyed it," I said. Holmes gave a thin smile. "Not quite. The real letter remains safely hidden in the lining of my violin case. What he destroyed was my forgery." That night, Holmes summoned Inspector Lestrade to the manor. By candlelight, he laid out the pieces before us all in the drawing room. Tate seated stiffly, arms folded, Eliza Mayhew tense with suspicion, Henry Ainsworth visibly shaken. Holmes began without preamble. "Mr. Tate," he said, "you entered the library tonight and burned a letter which you believed to be a confession written by Lady Eleanor." Tate's face remained blank. "I don't know what you're referring to." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "I believe that statement alone is worth noting." Then he continued, "Lady Eleanor was not Henry Ainsworth's biological mother. He was the child of Eleanor's sister, conceived in disgrace. Eleanor raised him as her own to protect the family name." There was a stunned silence. Holmes pressed on. "Mr. Tate, you were privy to this truth, likely from the beginning. You handled Lady Eleanor's affairs. You stood to gain a great deal of stability, perhaps even blackmail material, by maintaining the deception. But when the lady neared death and feared the truth would be buried forever, she wrote her confession and hid it." Tate scoffed. "And where is your proof?" Holmes calmly lifted the original letter from his pocket, sealed in a clear envelope. "Here." Tate's expression cracked for the first time. "You searched for it in the sewing room," Holmes said softly, "and when you suspected Eliza Mayhew may have found it, you murdered her." A collective gasp. "You then staged the scene to look like a break-in, rummaged the drawers, scattered personal effects. But it was unconvincing. You did not take any valuables. What you took was paper, evidence." "I didn't," Tate began, but his voice faltered. "You silenced the only person who might challenge Henry's inheritance, but you made one mistake. You assumed no one else knew where the letter had been hidden. And tonight, when presented with a forged version, your instinct was not disbelief, but destruction." Tate rose abruptly. "This is absurd. I'll not be accused without counsel." Lestrade stood. "You'll come with us, Mr. Tate." As the inspector escorted him out, Holmes turned to Henry Ainsworth, who had said nothing during the entire exchange. "You are not who you believed you were," Holmes said gently, "but your integrity remains untouched. What your mother, your true mother, suffered does not reflect on you. What matters now is how you choose to carry the truth." Henry's face was unreadable. He gave a short nod. That night, as we returned to our quarters, Holmes lit his pipe and stared into the darkness beyond the frosted window. "Do you think justice was done, Holmes?" I asked. "Justice, Watson," he replied slowly, "is rarely perfect. But truth at least, is clean." Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape evening had begun to settle across the rooftops of Bloomsbury, casting long ochre shadows through the leaded windows of the Ladywell estate. The air within the drawing-room, however, remained as tense and motionless as the expression on Holmes's face. He stood by the hearth, unmoving, his eyes fixed not on the fire, but on the pattern of ashes in the grate, as though deciphering some arcane script only he could read. Watson, meanwhile, sat rigidly in a stiff-backed armchair, notebook unopened in his lap. Despite his habitual habit of taking notes during cases, something about the atmosphere stilled even his pen. Beside him, Lady Thistlewood clutched a lace handkerchief in trembling fingers, her gaze flitting from Holmes to the window as though she expected someone, or something, to leap from the darkness at any moment. "There is," said Holmes quietly, not shifting his eyes from the fire. "Always a final move." Watson blinked. "You mean the killer is not finished?" Holmes turned then, slowly, like a figure carved from marble brought suddenly to life. "Oh, quite the contrary, my dear Watson. The killer is cornered, but a cornered beast is often the most dangerous." At that moment, a sound rang out, a sharp metallic click followed by hurried footsteps overhead. Holmes's head snapped up. "He's here." "Who?" Watson rose instinctively. "Our elusive crypt whisperer," Holmes replied, already striding toward the staircase with long, purposeful strides. "Stay with Lady Thistlewood. I'll need you shortly." Watson was halfway to the hall before he realized Holmes was gone, already vanished like smoke up the stairwell. The upper floor of the Ladywell estate was a narrow corridor lined with portraits, generations of glowering ancestors watching as Holmes ascended with almost spectral quiet. At the far end, a door creaked. Light spilled from a slightly ajar bedroom, Lord Percival's private study. Holmes reached it just as a figure inside slammed shut a drawer and turned sharply. For a fleeting moment the man's silhouette was etched in gold by the gaslight behind him, tall, lean, with angular shoulders and a pronounced limp in his stance. His name had not yet been spoken, but Holmes had known for some time. "Mr. Rook," said Holmes coldly. Rupert Rook, the estate steward, turned with a jerk, eyes blazing. "You shouldn't be here." Holmes stepped into the room. "You shouldn't be here either. This is Lord Percival's private sanctum." Rook's hand hovered near the desk drawer once more. "You don't know what you're interfering with." "Oh, but I do," said Holmes, voice smooth as ice. "The stolen records, the altered estate ledgers, the fabricated correspondence with foreign buyers, all a tapestry of deceit carefully stitched together by the loyal manservant who knew how to operate beneath the noses of nobles." Rook's expression twisted into something sharp and venomous. "You think you've pieced it together, don't you? You think you're clever." "I'm afraid that ship sailed long ago," Holmes replied. "You've been desperate ever since you discovered the teacup, since you realized Lady Thistlewood had placed it within the crypt after all." "She wasn't supposed to remember," Rook snapped. "The woman was half delirious with grief. I thought I'd buried it all." "And yet," Holmes said, stepping forward, "the truth has a habit of resurfacing, particularly when one hides it in an urn meant for ashes, beneath a name that never existed." Rook's face went pale. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "You forged the burial record of Samuel Thistlewood, a name fabricated entirely to conceal your theft. But the real Samuel, the one whose letters Lady Thistlewood began receiving posthumously, never existed beyond ink and fear." There was a long silence. Then Rook reached into the drawer. Holmes did not move. Rook retrieved not a weapon, but a small, heavy bundle wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, a silver inkwell, dented along one side, its base marked with the crest of the Ladywell family. "I kept this," Rook said hoarsely. "I don't know why. Some part of me thought if I held on to it, it'd all stay hidden." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "Guilt often demands trophies." Rook slammed the inkwell onto the desk, suddenly furious. "It was never about greed. I served that family for 22 years. I watched them throw money into the wind, waste their legacy on senseless travel and aristocratic dinners while the estate rotted. I wanted to preserve what mattered." "By forging heirs?" Holmes said with quiet disgust. by pushing a grieving woman toward madness? Rook's shoulders sagged. I never meant to hurt her. You killed Lord Percival. Rook's voice was barely a whisper. He found the letter, the one I meant to destroy. Holmes nodded. He confronted you in the crypt. There was a struggle. You struck him with that very inkwell, then arranged his body to appear as if he'd died of a faint spell. Rook swayed, staring at the object as though it were a snake coiled on the desk. You made a fatal error, Holmes continued. You left the teacup beside him, thinking no one would question its presence. But Lady Thistlewood did, and so did I. At that moment, a shout echoed from below, Watson's voice. Footsteps thundered upward. Rook turned, panicked. I won't be arrested, he hissed. I won't be humiliated. Then you'd rather compound your guilt with another crime? Holmes asked coolly. Rook lunged, not toward Holmes, but toward the sash window beyond the desk. In a single motion, he flung it open. Wind gusted in, sending papers skittering across the floor. Holmes advanced 2 swift steps and seized Rook's coat just as he began to climb out. You won't escape justice that way, Mr. Rook, he said through clenched teeth. You're not leaping from a ledge, you're leaping into consequence. Rook struggled, but Holmes held firm. Moments later, Watson and Inspector Gregson burst in, weapons drawn, only to find Holmes restraining the defeated steward by the collar, both men silhouetted against the London skyline. Rook was led down the stairs in silence, face ashen. Lady Thistlewood stood at the bottom, back straight, eyes hollow. As the door closed behind him, Holmes turned to her gently. The ghost of the crypt has been laid to rest, Lady Thistlewood. She said nothing, only inclined her head, clutching the worn teacup Holmes had returned to her earlier in the evening. Her lips moved, but no words escaped, only a breath, as though mourning something older than grief. Watson stepped beside Holmes. You had him from the moment he said the name Samuel. I had him from the moment I saw the teacup's position, Holmes replied, but I needed him to believe he was still safe. Now the house may finally sleep in peace. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in, the final clue revealed. It was nearly midnight when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The rain had begun to fall in light sheets across the city, lending a peculiar quiet to the streets of London. Our hansom cab rattled over glistening cobblestones, and for a time neither of us spoke. The arrest of Rupert Rook had left a lingering tension in the air, though the most immediate danger had passed. Holmes was deep in thought, as he often was following the climax of a case, yet there remained in his expression the faint suggestion of incompletion. I recognized the signs well enough, the slightly furrowed brow, the way his fingers tapped absently against his coat buttons. You believe there's more to the matter, I said, as we stepped into the dry warmth of our lodgings. He removed his hat and gloves and replied absently, Indeed, Watson. I believe we have yet to find the cornerstone of the truth. But, Rook confessed, the ledgers, the forged letters, the attack in the crypt, it all fits. Fits, Holmes echoed, pouring himself a measure of brandy. Yes, but only as a tailored coat fits a mannequin, not the man. It wears well, but does not breathe. I frowned. Then you suspect someone else? No, not someone else, Holmes said, lowering himself into his armchair. Rather, I suspect that Rook's motivations were not entirely of his own making. The sequence of events points to a larger orchestration. I paused in mid-thought, sitting opposite him. Are you suggesting he was manipulated? Holmes did not answer immediately. He reached for a letter from the mantel. a copy of the supposed correspondence that Rook had forged in the name of the fictional Samuel Thistlewood. Holmes tapped its corner lightly. "There are nuances in the ink," he murmured. "The hand is disguised, but not untraceable." I peered over. "The slant?" "More than that," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing. "The pressure on the downstroke, the irregularity in the spacing, traits found in one other piece of correspondence I examined while at the Ladywell estate. A letter Lady Thistlewood once received from her late husband's solicitor. Or so she believed." "You don't mean—" "I do." Holmes stood abruptly. "We must return tonight." The estate was still under Scotland Yard's supervision, though the constables posted at the gates looked more concerned with sleep than security. We were admitted by Inspector Gregson, who had remained behind to inventory the documents in Rook's quarters. "Another theory, Mr. Holmes?" Gregson asked, voice dry. Holmes offered only a thin smile. "A final thread, Inspector. I'll not disturb your work long." Holmes moved with quiet precision through the manor, leading us not to the crypt nor to the steward's room, but to the West Wing library. The door creaked open. Inside, moonlight draped across the reading chairs and mahogany shelves. Holmes crossed swiftly to the writing desk that had belonged to Lord Percival and withdrew a small sheaf of papers from the rear compartment. He laid them on the desk and motioned me forward. "There," he said, indicating the header of a legal document, "is the match to Rook's forged letter." I examined the text. The similarity in the script was indeed striking, not identical, but carrying unmistakable idiosyncrasies. Holmes pulled out a magnifying glass and turned the page to the reverse. "Note the watermark," he said. It read, "Montague Press and Sons, Inkston Lane, 1877 edition." Holmes looked up at me. A rare press, only used for a few years, and by even fewer firms. I traced the use of this stationery through Ladywell's outgoing communications. It was not Rook who used this paper. It was used exclusively by Lord Percival's legal adviser, Mr. Horace Gall. I blinked. Then Gall forged the letter. "Not only the letter, Watson." Holmes tapped the page once more. "He engineered the entire fabrication. Rook was not the mastermind, he was a puppet. The motive, however, was not wealth nor blackmail. It was inheritance." I followed the line of Holmes's thinking with growing clarity. Gall must have known something about the will, something dangerous to him if discovered. Precisely. Lord Percival was planning to amend his will. Gall, having long managed the family's trusts and documents, learned of this late in the process. The addition of an unnamed heir, possibly a child born out of wedlock, would have upended the estate's distribution. Gall fabricated the identity of Samuel Thistlewood, a fictional son, to mask the real one. Then, through Rook, he orchestrated the suppression of that knowledge. "And the teacup?" Holmes turned to the nearby cabinet and opened it. From within, he retrieved the item in question, now cleaned and catalogued by the Yard. It was left not by chance, but as a warning, a symbol tied to the fabricated identity. Gall used it as a signature of sorts, ensuring Lady Thistlewood would remain haunted by the fiction while keeping Rook beholden to him. "But she remembered," I said slowly. "She remembered enough to spark doubt. That was all it took." Just then, footsteps echoed behind us. Gregson reappeared, holding a wire in his hand. "A telegram just arrived for you, Mr. Holmes, from a solicitor's clerk named Jennings. You asked him to compare signatures from Gall's old correspondence." Holmes took the wire, read it, and handed it to me. Signature confirmed, Horace Gall authored both the forged burial record and posthumous letters. Clark confirms deception extends over 7 years. Holmes exhaled slowly. It is as I feared. Gall did not merely commit fraud. He constructed an entire false narrative, manipulated a grieving steward, and likely orchestrated the scene that led to Lord Percival's death. What now? We confront him, Holmes said simply, before sunrise. The dawn was breaking when we reached Gall's Chelsea townhouse. The butler answered, pale and trembling. I'm afraid Mr. Gall left early this morning, he stammered. He said something about a long journey to the coast. Holmes turned on his heel. Then we must beat him there. Gregson, telegraph the ports and request a hold on all outbound ships bearing his name. The net must tighten now, or he will vanish into the continent. Gregson rushed off without delay, and Holmes turned to me with a grim set to his jaw. Justice, Watson, he said. Justice must not be allowed to take the last train while deceit boards the first steamer. And with that, we descended the steps once more, the rising sun behind us, and the truth at last laid bare, though its price, as always, had been paid in shadows and silence. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. It was just past 9 o'clock when Holmes summoned all the key figures in the case to Ladywell Manor. The estate's drawing room, normally reserved for polite society, had transformed into a quiet theatre of tension and suspicion. The rain from the previous evening had abated, leaving the windows streaked and fogged from the morning's chill. A fire burned low in the hearth, more for ceremony than warmth. Present were Lady Thistlewood, pale but composed, Inspector Gregson, standing stiffly near the door, Miss Georgina Hargreaves, the housekeeper whose hands fidgeted with a handkerchief, Edward Blythe, the steward's assistant, and, surprisingly, Rupert Rooke himself, brought under guarded parole and seated near the wall like a wounded animal unsure of its cage. Holmes stood at the centre, tall and grave, fingertips pressed together, as though composing a sonata in silence. I watched from my seat nearby, pen in hand, heart tight with anticipation. Holmes had said little on the journey back from Chelsea, only that everything now lay clear, and that Gall's disappearance had not altered the necessity of unveiling the full truth. My apologies for the early summons, Holmes began, but clarity, when long delayed, becomes a burden. I believe we are all due some relief. Lady Thistlewood looked up. You have caught him, then, this solicitor? Horace Gall is being pursued as we speak, but it is not merely his apprehension that brings us here. What concerns me is the shadow he cast, not alone, but with others, upon this house, this family, and one lost life in particular. He turned, walking slowly across the room as if addressing a jury. We began with a crypt, a teacup placed oddly on stone beside the body of Lord Percival Thistlewood, his skull fractured, death presumed accidental or perhaps self-inflicted. Miss Hargreaves shifted uncomfortably. Rooke stared at the floor. And then letters emerged, Holmes continued, suggesting the existence of a son named Samuel, a cruel fiction designed to obscure the truth. And yet, some truths hide within lies. Holmes paused beside the mantel, where a faded portrait of Lord Thistlewood hung, a man of firm jaw and distant gaze. The deception, Holmes said, was not in the idea that Lord Thistlewood had fathered a child. That part was true. There was a murmur among the gathered. Lady Thistlewood's gloved hand clutched the arm of her chair. The fiction was in the child's name and story. Gall, seeing the original amendment to Lord Thistlewood's will and learning of the heir's existence, forged a separate narrative, a distraction to make the truth too muddy to pursue. Gregson cleared his throat. "Are you saying the heir is still alive?" "I am," said Holmes, "and they are in this very room." Gasps followed. Miss Hargreaves looked sharply at Edward Blythe, who in turn glanced at Lady Thistlewood. Holmes nodded toward Rupert Rooke. Rooke did not know the full story. He believed in Samuel Thistlewood because Gaul made him believe. He carried out the acts of intimidation, disguising warnings as hauntings, staging accidents, because he was made to feel he was protecting the rightful heir. "I thought I was doing what the master would have wanted," Rooke muttered. "He said Samuel was hidden, that I had to keep the secret, keep the estate safe." Holmes silenced him with a raised hand, then turned to Lady Thistlewood. "Your husband, madam, once told you he had made a mistake in his youth. That mistake was not a crime of dishonor. It was a life, conceived with a servant girl before he met you. He never knew the child until years later, when a letter reached him from the girl, dying of consumption. She asked only that the boy be given a chance." Lady Thistlewood's expression crumpled with painful recognition. "That was when he began taking secret meetings," she whispered, "when he started locking away papers." Holmes approached the sideboard and drew forth a slim box of records he had uncovered earlier in the library. The boy was placed in service here, under Gaul's management. Gaul ensured the lad remained unaware of his birthright, fearing that a shift in inheritance would expose years of embezzlement from the estate's funds. Holmes turned toward Edward Blythe, who had gone utterly pale. "You, Mr. Blythe, were that boy." Blythe took a step back. No, I was born in Sussex. My mother was a housemaid named Annie Chivers," Holmes said, "transferred to Sussex after working briefly at Ladywell. I found your name, your true one, in Gaul's employment registry, buried among cleaning staff under a pseudonym. When Lord Thistlewood learned the truth, he made plans to legitimize you in his will. That was the moment Gaul knew his crimes would be discovered." Lady Thistlewood stood slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. "Percival would have told me. In time he would have. I would not have refused him." Holmes bowed his head briefly. "But he died before he could." Miss Hargreaves let out a choked sob. I always suspected Gaul. He was so quiet, always in Lord Thistlewood's study, always watching people, but I didn't know about Mr. Blythe." Blythe could barely speak. I don't know what to say. I never knew. I swear to you, I never knew." Holmes looked at him with something like sympathy. "You were a pawn, Mr. Blythe, like many others in this case, but the time for silence is past. With Gaul in custody, and with proper examination of the documents he tried so hard to hide, the truth can now be recognized. You are the late Lord's son. You have a right not just to the estate, but to the name he sought to give you." A stillness filled the room. Not disbelief, only awe at the scale of what had lain hidden behind ordinary faces, dusty letters, and a porcelain teacup. Gregson cleared his throat. "I'll have Rooke transferred back into custody," he said, "and I'll notify the Crown Solicitor about Gaul's status and Mr. Blythe's claim." Holmes nodded. "Do so with care. This is not a case that demands sensational headlines. It demands dignity." As the constables moved to escort Rooke out, and as the others slowly dispersed, Lady Thistlewood approached Edward Blythe and gently touched his sleeve. "You have your father's eyes," she said softly. Holmes and I waited by the fire until the last footsteps faded. "You see, Watson," Holmes said at last, "sometimes it is not the mystery that is the hardest to solve. It is persuading the world to believe it." And with that, he turned to the window, watching the clouds break over the morning sky. Chapter 16. The Masterstroke. The fire in the drawing room had burned low, casting long amber shadows across the Persian rug, and still Holmes remained standing, his gaze fixed not on the assembled guests, but inward, toward the tapestry of the crime he was about to lay bare. I knew the signs well: the tightening of his hands behind his back, the slight narrowing of his eyes. This was the moment he had been building to since first inspecting the crypt. "Now," he began, his tone quiet yet commanding, "let us dispense with illusions." Holmes turned slowly toward the gathered party. Lady Thistlewood seated with hands clasped tightly in her lap, Inspector Gregson with notepad in hand, Miss Hargreaves frozen near the mantel, and Edward Blythe, who stood with the posture of a man recently told he'd been living a life not his own. "You may recall that I said Lord Thistlewood's death appeared illogical," Holmes said. "Indeed, what man enters his own crypt with a teacup only to die beside it with no signs of violence save for a fractured skull? The scene was designed to disorient, to remove intent from consequence. But the key to unraveling the entire mystery lies in a single, overlooked detail." He turned to me. "Watson, do you recall the placement of the cup?" "Certainly," I said, flipping through my notes. "It was placed upright, beside the left heel of the body, on a flat square of stone. No saucer, no signs of spillage." "Precisely," Holmes said. "And therein lies the deception. A man who trips and falls does not place a teacup so precisely, upright, without breakage. The scene was not natural, it was staged. But the staging was clumsy. It was not meant to suggest suicide or murder. It was meant to confuse, to delay the realization that Lord Thistlewood's body had been moved." A murmur of disbelief stirred. Holmes continued. "He did not die in the crypt. The crypt merely became a final stage, a theatre of death. The true site of his demise was the garden conservatory, where the flagstones had been scrubbed clean. I found faint traces of blood beneath the soil in the potted delphiniums." Lady Thistlewood's hand flew to her mouth. "But that room is always locked." "Indeed, except when Rupert Rook held the keys," Holmes said, nodding toward the servant. "He was Gall's accomplice in the cover-up, though likely not the killing itself. It was Gall who arranged the murder." Inspector Gregson snapped up. "You're sure of that? No struggle? No forced entry?" "No need for struggle," Holmes replied. "Lord Thistlewood trusted Gall. He summoned him that evening for the final review of the revised will, one that named Edward Blythe as his legitimate heir. Gall, realizing that discovery meant exposure of his years of theft from the estate, acted decisively. He struck Lord Thistlewood with a marble sundial base, an improvised weapon I recovered in the hedge border, and then enlisted Rook to help remove the body. Miss Hargreaves, pale as wax, whispered, "That night, I thought I heard someone in the garden, a soft, dragging noise." "Not imagination, Miss Hargreaves," Holmes said gently. "You heard the truth." He turned now to Edward Blythe. "You, sir, were placed in this estate as a child, under the guise of employment, never knowing your true name. Gall needed you close enough to monitor, but far enough that you might never guess the truth. When Lord Thistlewood attempted to right the wrong, Gall knew his time was up." "But the letters," Blythe said, "the ones about Samuel, was that all a fabrication?" "Partially," said Holmes. "Gall forged Samuel's identity to introduce noise into the signal, to plant a false trail. The letters were crafted from real documents, altered with new names and dates, then hidden away to be found only after Gall had fled. He assumed, correctly, that Rook would interpret them as instruction. Gregson scowled. But why the theatrics, the haunted bells, the broken ink pot, the mirror in the corridor? To induce fear, Holmes replied, not in the suspects, but in the rightful heir. Gall wished to keep Edward from pressing too deeply. The hauntings, the apparitions, those were Rook's work, guided by Gall's instructions. Holmes paced slowly. Even the whisper in the sewing room, a voice that Lady Thistlewood claimed came from nowhere. It was a planted phonograph cylinder, hidden behind the paneling, set to play when a pressure trigger on the floor was engaged. Rook placed it there the night before. Gasps rose from every corner of the room. Lady Thistlewood leaned forward. Then, the sewing room was not haunted at all. Holmes inclined his head. Not by spirits, no, only by a very deliberate kind of misdirection, a whisper designed to unnerve, to suggest the presence of something otherworldly, and to make any talk of hidden heirs or rewritten wills seem like madness. Holmes returned to the hearth and took up a folded document from the sideboard. "This," he said, "is the true will, hidden behind the false one Gall had intended to substitute. It names Edward Blythe, born Edward Chivers, as the sole beneficiary of the estate. It was never signed. Lord Thistlewood was killed before he could. But Gall's forged documents, prepared for the deception, betray the very evidence of the real document's existence. He tried to burn the original draft, but fire leaves its own trail." Gregson stepped forward and took the paper. "We'll send this to the legal office at once. The Crown can begin the process of review." Holmes turned to me and offered a rare smile. "Watson, the most powerful weapon in crime is not the gun or blade, it is the lie. But lies, however cleverly spun, always fray at the edges." I nodded, and it was a teacup, placed too carefully, that began the unraveling. "Indeed," Holmes replied, "it always begins with a detail, one crack in the mirror." The case, at last, stood complete. The mystery had untangled not by brute force or coincidence, but by quiet logic, patient scrutiny, and the unshakable mind of Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The events that followed Holmes's final revelation unfolded with a sort of grim inevitability, as though the air itself had grown heavy with consequence. Inspector Gregson moved quickly, signalling to the two constables waiting in the hall. With solemn professionalism, they stepped forward and approached Rupert Rook, who now stood ashen and shaking by the sideboard. Holmes spoke before the inspector could. "You will find the phonograph device behind the north panel in the sewing room just above the skirting board. It was likely installed using carpenter's glue, no nails, for fear of detection. Retrieve it carefully. It will bear Gall's fingerprints, along with a sliver of candle wax used to activate the recording." Gregson gave a curt nod. "And Rook?" "Accessory after the fact," Holmes replied calmly. "A coward, not a killer. He should not be treated with cruelty, but nor should his complicity be overlooked. He helped conceal the crime and attempted to terrify Lady Thistlewood into madness or silence. That much cannot be ignored." The constables took Rook gently but firmly by the arms. His lips quivered, but he made no resistance. As he passed Lady Thistlewood, he lowered his eyes and said hoarsely, "I didn't want any of it, milady, but I was already too deep." Holmes offered no further word, only a slight turn of the head, as if even contempt were a courtesy Rook did not deserve. Gregson turned his attention to Gall, but Gall was not there. The man had slipped away. During the height of Holmes's deduction, he had eased back into the shadows of the corridor, vanishing with the soft footfalls of a practiced deceiver. By the time Gregson realized, Gaul was already gone from the manor. A cry went up from the hall. "Back gate open! Blast it!" Gregson snarled. "He's had a head start." Holmes, ever composed, moved to the window overlooking the back garden. He will not get far. He has taken nothing with him. Not coin, not coat. A man on the run without preparation is a man easily found. Notify the station at Charing. Tell them to check the southbound coaches to Dover. Gaul's mind is quick, but predictable. He will seek to flee by sea. "I'll wire them now," Gregson said, already halfway out the door. Edward Blythe had remained silent until now. He stepped forward, face taut with 1,000 unspoken questions. "Mr. Holmes, I don't understand. If Gaul had gone to such lengths to keep me hidden, why keep me on the estate at all?" Holmes looked at him steadily. "Because the most dangerous truths are those hidden in plain sight." Gaul believed that proximity ensured silence. If he could ensure that you never discovered your true parentage, he could monitor any rising suspicion and suppress it. But what he failed to account for was the will of a dying man. Lord Thistlewood's conscience had awakened. And that, Mr. Blythe, is a force even the most meticulous villain cannot contain. Lady Thistlewood rose slowly, her eyes wet but steady. She crossed the room and took Edward's hand. "I see him in you now," she whispered. "My husband. He never spoke of the child, but I always suspected. He had a softness in his voice when he spoke of the gardener's boy, and guilt in his eyes." Edward swallowed hard. "I never knew my mother." "No," she said, and a flicker of old sorrow passed across her face. "He never spoke of her either, but if she loved him and gave him you, then she must have had a noble heart." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the ivy against the lead-glass panes. Holmes stood apart, near the fire, his face unreadable. He did not seek praise, nor did he appear moved by the drama unfolding before him. He lit his pipe with surgical precision and allowed the silence to settle. It was I who broke it. "Holmes, if Gaul is caught, will he hang?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "That will depend on the Crown Prosecutor. But I believe so. His was not a crime of passion or circumstance. It was deliberate, calculated, and he corrupted others to protect himself." Lady Thistlewood turned to Holmes, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what will happen to this place, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes inclined his head. "That is a question for Mr. Blythe now, though I dare say it will take time before he chooses to wear the Thistlewood name." Edward shook his head. "I don't know what I'll do. I've lived in the servants' wing since I was 8. Now I'm told I belong in the gallery above the great hall." Holmes finally looked him full in the eye. "Then remember, Mr. Blythe, nobility is not worn, it is lived. Your past may have been cloaked in deception, but what you choose next will be entirely your own." The room grew still. Outside, the bells of St. Jude's began to toll 7, a low, solemn chime that echoed across the moor and into the hearts of those within. Not a ghost's bell, not a whisper in the dark, but the real sound of time moving forward. Gregson returned, breathless. "We've sent word to all stations. We'll have Gaul by morning." Holmes simply nodded, then turned to me. "Watson, have you brought your coat?" I blinked. "Yes. Why?" "We're not staying the night. I find the countryside too philosophical after justice has been served. Let us return to Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson will have a hot supper, and I believe I owe you a game of chess." And with that, Holmes strode toward the door, leaving behind a manor no longer haunted, save, perhaps, by memory. Chapter 18. Holmes' Final Reflection. It was not until the following evening that Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The train ride from Dartmoor had been marked by long stretches of silence, Holmes deep in his own world of thought, and I content to let the rhythm of the carriage wheels soothe what remained of my astonishment. I confess I was still processing the labyrinthine chain of events that had led from a whisper in a Manners sewing room to the exposure of a murderer and the revelation of a hidden heir. Mrs. Hudson welcomed us with her usual blend of efficiency and mild disapproval at our muddied boots. She had laid out a modest supper, cold beef, pickled onions, and a pot of tea that was strong enough to revive the dead. Holmes thanked her absently and moved straight to the fireplace, lighting it though the evening was mild. I poured the tea, handed him a cup, and settled opposite. "Well, Holmes," I said finally, "you've done it again. And yet I must ask. You suspected Gall from the beginning, didn't you?" He gave me a faint smile. "I suspected only that the situation required a mind more complex than Rook's. From the moment I observed the placement of the crypt's candle, burnt nearly to its base yet lacking a trail of wax, and the unnatural chill in the sewing room, I deduced a manipulation of the senses. Rook does not possess the subtlety for such a scheme. But why the elaborate haunting, the teacup, the phonograph, the flickering candlelight? Why go to such theatrical lengths? Because fear clouds logic, Watson. Lady Thistlewood was the linchpin of the estate. Her sanity protected the will, the property, and the silence Gall required. If she were dismissed as unstable, the estate would pass into limbo, ripe for exploitation. And let us not forget, Rook owed Gall for concealing the original switch of Edward Blythe into servitude. Guilt and loyalty make poor sentinels. I shook my head. And Edward, he took it all rather well, didn't he? As well as one might, Holmes murmured. There is a curious peace in discovering the truth of oneself, even if it overturns the life one has known. We sat for a moment longer before I ventured another question. You mentioned the candle as the first anomaly. What of the others? The teacup, for instance? Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled. The teacup found in the crypt was an obvious plant. Lady Thistlewood stated she had not entered the crypt in months, yet the teacup bore no dust and no signs of moisture seepage from the stone walls. That indicated recent placement, an act of staging. It was Gall's attempt to tether the haunting to the past, to suggest an ethereal return. And the sewing thread tied to the window latch. Another illusion. When I found the thread wound in a sailor's loop, something no lady of refinement would tie, it became clear that Gall, or someone under his instruction, had staged the tugging spirit incident. The breeze, when passing through the outer vents, would cause the thread to move subtly, creating the impression of invisible interference. Clever, I admitted. And the phonograph, how did you deduce its location? I followed the dust, Holmes replied. The sewing room had been swept, yes, but not thoroughly. Near the skirting board, a faint indentation suggested something had been moved recently and replaced. Combined with Lady Thistlewood's claims of hearing her husband's voice when alone, it led me to search for an artificial source. I sipped my tea, marveling. And Gall's escape? As I said, he will be caught. There is no honor among the cunning, Watson. He may survive the gallows for now, but he will not survive himself. Men who manipulate grief as he did seldom die peacefully. Holmes rose and crossed to the mantel, where he extracted his violin from its case. With a few plucks of the strings, he tuned it, then drew the bow with a long, meditative stroke. The notes that followed were low and pensive, neither joyful nor mournful, but something in between. After a moment he said, "Do you know, Watson, what struck me most about the case?" "No, Holmes. What?" He turned slightly. That Lady Thistlewood, in all her grief, had sensed the lie. Women like her, those whose lives are ruled by etiquette and restraint, often see more than they admit. She suspected long before she dared speak, but society teaches them to doubt themselves. There was a deep compassion in his voice, rare and unguarded. I sat quietly, struck by it. Holmes continued, and Rook, fool though he was, sought redemption in his own pathetic way. It never came, of course. Redemption, like murder, requires intent. He played another fragment of melody, something almost Slavic in its sorrow, and then set the violin aside. "Come, Watson," he said. "We have survived the ghosts of Devonshire, unmasked a killer, and unearthed a bastard heir to an English title. Let us rest before the next storm arrives." I smiled. "You sound weary, Holmes." "Only of deception," he replied, "and of poor quality tea. Yours, at least, has revived me." We both laughed, and for a moment Baker Street felt more like a hearth than a headquarters. The lamplight flickered. Somewhere outside, a carriage rumbled past, and in that moment, with Holmes once again by the fire and my pen ready to record the tale for posterity, I felt the strange comfort of logic prevailing over chaos. It is, I believe, the highest justice Holmes ever served. And as always, he would only call it elementary.